Everyone, and welcome back to Be Like Christ for our Bible study. We're in Luke chapter 7, picking up in verse 18. I'm in disguise today. I don't know if for anyone listening to the podcast, you're not going to have a clue what I'm talking about. I have on my hat and glasses, partially to keep my head warm because this room in the apartment is freezing, but also just because it's just one of those days. No contacts, hair's a mess. And you'll notice if I put my head down that this hat is all muddy. This is my hiking hat, so it's not the prettiest hat in the world. But that being said, we can still accomplish our Bible study, dirty hat or clean hat. Luke chapter 7, verse 18. Let's read 18 and 19. If you want the notes, there are links down in the description to both the physical copy of the book and the digital copies. Okay, Jesus has just raised the widow's son in Nain from the dead, and now he's going to have an interaction with some of John the Baptist's disciples. Verse 18, the disciples of John reported all of these things to him, and John, calling two of his disciples to him, sent them to the Lord, saying, "Are you the one who is to come, or shall we look for another?" This discussion has a parallel in Matthew chapter 11. And I was just working on my Matthew in 5 Minutes book earlier today, so I'm all mixed up between the details of these two different chapters and where everything falls in the context. But anyway, you can read the same story in Matthew chapter 11. John has been in prison since Luke chapter 3, verse 20. We don't exactly know how long that was, but it seems like a somewhat decent amount of time. And perhaps some doubts had crept up in John's mind during his imprisonment. So he sent two of his students, his disciples, to go and to ask Jesus if he was the one, meaning if he was the Christ, the prophesied Messiah that they were supposed to be looking for, or if it was somebody else. And if you've read much of the Gospels and you're familiar with the details, this might be really strange to you because you say, wait a second, wasn't John already talking about Jesus as the Messiah, as the Lamb of God? He baptized Jesus. He heard the voice from heaven saying, "This is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased." So why is he now sending disciples to Jesus to ask him if he's the Christ? Seemed like he was clear on that earlier. Why is he no longer confident? And I think that's a good question. I suspect that the answer is to be found in John's circumstances. It's one thing to acknowledge and to believe a fact when everything in your life is going well. It's somewhat more difficult when things in your life start to go poorly, or you get into a rough patch. Difficulty and hardship test us. They can discourage us, and they can also introduce doubts into our mind. Maybe you've gone through a process like that before. As I mentioned, we don't know exactly how long John had been in prison, but it may have been the case that these tough circumstances introduced some doubts into his mind. Maybe he thought that if Jesus was really the Messiah and had all this power, why wasn't he busting him out of jail? Why was he going to leave? Why did he leave him in there so long? Perhaps we don't know exactly all that John understood about the Messiah, but if any of the old Jewish traditions had gotten into his mind about the Messiah being this conqueror and conquester of the Romans and the overthrower of Herod who oppressed him, then maybe he thought, Jesus was, what was Jesus waiting for? Come on, start the rebellion. Get me out of jail here. He wasn't seeing Jesus kind of moving in that direction or hearing about him. And so he's like, okay, what's going on? So he sends two disciples to Jesus to confirm what he thought he knew. And I think there's a good application here, and that is that just people with strong faith can sometimes struggle with doubts. Great servants of God can sometimes struggle with doubts. Having faith doesn't remove all doubts from our mind, right? We're still going to wrestle with some of those things and still going to be seeking answers for things, maybe even after we've become a disciple or follower of Christ. There's always questions to be asked and things to evaluate and evidence to look for. So like like John, though, he sets a good example for us in the fact that he goes to the right source to get his answers into his evidence. He sends people to Jesus to ask the questions that are in his mind. And he doesn't just say, well, I have these doubts, and so I'm tossing out the whole idea of what I used to believe. Unfortunately, there's a lot of people in our modern world who kind of fall into that category. They are introduced to some new concepts, and maybe they have some new doubts, but rather than actually going and looking for the evidence to find the truth, they just kind of toss everything out the window and say, I have no idea what I believe anymore. I reject everything I used to believe. But they don't really do an evaluation of the facts and the evidence. Another application from this I think we can take is that great servants of God might not always appear the way that we expect them to. Sometimes we think about great servants of God, maybe like Paul, traveling around the world, going to all these places, establishing all of these churches. Maybe you think of like a Billy Graham type of character, preaching to 1 million people in South Korea. I don't know if you've ever seen those pictures, but they're incredible. I'm not a Billy Graham, follower, but just amazing how many people used to come listen to him. Or maybe we have this idea that a great servant of God is an author who everyone reads and they sell a bunch of books and things. Or a great preacher in a pulpit somewhere. Here, a great servant of God is kind of off in obscurity, taken out of the public eye, locked up in jail for preaching the truth. And no doubt there are great servants of God in that situation today, people that you don't know about, locked up around the world who have served God honorably. And so just recognize that great faith doesn't always mean a public platform. Okay, moving on now to verse 20 through 22. And when the men had come to him, that's John's disciples, they said, John the Baptist has sent us to you, saying, Are you the one who is to come, or shall we look for another? In that hour he healed many people of diseases and plagues and evil spirits, and on many who were blind he bestowed sight. And he answered them, Go, and tell John what you have seen and heard. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear. The dead are raised up, the poor have good news preached to them. John's disciples, they come to Jesus, they ask him if he's the Messiah or if they should be looking for somebody else. And I like the way that Jesus responds to both them and to John. He doesn't reprimand John for doubting. He doesn't say, that John, he was good for a while, but now he just, needs to man up and have more faith and believe a little bit harder. He doesn't do that. Instead, he points them to the evidence. So he was preaching about the coming of the kingdom. That was consistent with John's message. He was performing great miracles. That was consistent with the Messiah that John knew was coming. And his display of power that these disciples were getting to witness, this was evidence that they were supposed to take back to John to reveal the identity that Jesus was, who he actually said he was, that he was the Messiah, because nobody else could possibly work these miracles without the power of God. And if Jesus had the power of God, then he wasn't lying about his identity. And the words that John had heard, that this is my beloved son, those were being confirmed to be true. So people were being healed of diseases and plagues and evil spirits in front of audiences and crowds of people. I mean, this scene would have been, this isn't like modern faith healings that happen and, maybe there's a witness or two or none, and their credibility is questionable even if there are some. This is like somebody walking into the public hospital in my hometown and just healing people and raising dead people. It's just on a different level. So this is the evidence that Jesus gives for these disciples to take back to John to reassure him in his doubts. And that got me thinking about, sometimes just hard evidence, provable facts are the best medicine for a doubting, emotion-stricken soul. Sometimes people think that facts are hard and they're unfeeling and they're not what people need when they're struggling. But for me personally, I found that sometimes when I'm consumed by emotion or just like in a period of struggle, and maybe I have all these questions swirling around in my head, sometimes the best thing that I can do is to remind myself of what I know to be true. That this world that we live in is designed by a God, it is designed by intelligence, and that Jesus was a real individual, historically proven, that the Bible can be trusted. And once I restore my confidence in those pillar truths, I can kind of put myself back on track, or God can put me back on track to kind of get around the other things that I'm struggling with and give me a foundation from which to tackle those things. Evidence, facts, proof, those can be really helpful, and it probably depends a little bit on the person that you're talking to and their personality and the way that they deal with those things. But don't always rule those out as ineffective tools for reassuring and, I guess you could say, counseling somebody. Okay, verse 23. And blessed is the one who is not offended by me. I think this is a little bit more challenging to understand, but I think once we get our head wrapped around it, it really makes sense. So the last thing that Jesus tells John's disciples is that those who aren't offended by him are going to be blessed. People are often offended at the way that Jesus presented God, the way that the apostles presented God. People were offended by the way that Jesus presented himself. And perhaps if John believed, perhaps John thought, if God has all this power and all this ability, he would break me out of jail. If he's supposed to be this political leader, then he's going to break me out of jail. Why hasn't it happened yet? John could have been offended by the fact that Jesus didn't use his power to get him out of jail. But John recognized that Jesus had a bigger plan in mind, something far greater, and he was just one small piece of that plan, and he played the role that God gave him to play and submitted to God's will even in those tough circumstances, because he was contributing to something far more important than just his personal freedom. Now, there's a lot of people that only think about themselves. So when Jesus came and he presented himself that way, John could have been like, forget this, and forget Jesus. Obviously, John wasn't like that. But Jesus says here, blessed is John, and I think really he's making a general statement. Blessed is anyone who's not offended by the God that I present to them and the plan that he has for them. So there's a lot of people that find offense rather than salvation in the words of Jesus. And instead of making him the foundation and the rock on which they build their lives, rather they find Jesus to be a stumbling block in the way of them living the life that they want to live based on their personal principles and their personal evaluation of what's right and wrong and their personal morality. Right? Jesus is just a roadblock to them continuing down that road. There are a lot of people who witnessed Jesus' miracles but still rejected him because of some kind of, quote, offense. Maybe they didn't like the way he looked. Maybe they were offended. They were insulted that a man who had no formal education could have so much to teach them. And maybe they were offended by the idea that they should humble themselves to his tutelage or to his teaching. Maybe some of the things he did stepped on their toes and violated what they thought was right and wrong and what they judged to be right and wrong and permissible and not permissible. No doubt that happened plenty of times, and they were offended by that. Maybe he wasn't the Messiah that they had dreamed up in their minds, and so they weren't ready to accept him. Offense is, as defined in the dictionary, an annoyance or a resentment brought about by a perceived insult to or a disregard for oneself or, notice this, one's standards or principles. So when somebody disregards your principles, you become offended. And that's very common in our culture today, right? People say, I'm offended, right? I have an idea for the way that I want to live, and since you don't agree with me, you've offended me. Oh, I'm so offended. Well, this can happen with people are so so connected to their personal principles and their personal evaluation of what's right and wrong, that when Jesus comes along and he says, no, it doesn't matter what you say is right and wrong, it matters what God says is right and wrong, that's destined to offend some people, right? Two truths, I think, keep a lot of people from accepting the message of Christ and accepting God and the leading of the Holy Spirit. Number one, they don't like the idea that God is greater than them. It takes a level of humility to admit that you're not the greatest thing in the universe and the ultimate authority in the universe. And the second thing is that his principle, people don't like the idea that God has the say, that he defines morality. I don't. He tells me what is sin, what isn't sin. I don't get to choose that. Tons and tons of people wish and attempt to be the deciders of good and evil. They try to redefine terms and say that this is virtuous or this is evil, or just watch the news. Right? How many people are trying to say that gay marriages are virtuous and beautiful, and hate is what belongs to the Christian side of things because they try to stop what is virtuous and beautiful? What is that? Well, it's human beings trying to be the definers of good and evil. Jesus comes along and he says, no, you don't get to do that. And that's offensive to a lot of people. Jesus says, blessed is the one who's not offended by my presentation of true morality and the true God in heaven. This was a problem in the first century. This was also is a problem in our modern day. Let me read what I have in my notes here. God and Jesus, as presented in the scriptures, offend people. So they deny the true Christ and his true teaching, and they establish rules based on their values. Or they reinterpret Christ to align with their principles. Jesus was saying, blessed is the one who doesn't take offense at my true nature and true character. Blessed is the one who is willing to accept the Savior and the God who sent him. I think for the application, we've kind of touched on this, but people can reject what is obvious and what is evidence-based if they have some personal reason to do it. They have some personal motive. If they find the implications of it being true undesirable. I think creation is a good example of this. I live in Guam. It's a beautiful island in the Pacific Ocean. You look around, to deny that somebody created this place, the millions and millions, billions of fish in the ocean, each one of them are unique. All the animals on the land, the tiny little crabs that crawl across the ground, just the incredible beauty in the sky and the rainbows that appear here all the time. It is completely illogical. And I mean that in the most with the most vigor that I can say it. It is completely illogical to believe that somebody did not design this place, and yet people do it. And why is that? Well, I think a lot of it has to do with they don't like the implications of this place being designed. They don't like the idea of there being a creator God because of what that, if you believe that there's a creator, then you have to admit there's something greater than you, and there's something that you have to submit to. And so it might be for that reason that they reject. It could also be that they are offended, or they don't want to be associated with the idea of creation. Because in academia, creationism is presented as the position of the uneducated. The anti-scientific. Only an anti-scientific person or uneducated person would believe and actually teach that there is a God, because that's so ridiculous. And unfortunately, that message is preached so hard that there are a lot of people who don't want to be associated with the teaching of creation. They're offended and ashamed to be aligned with that, and so they reject it. Jesus says what? Blessed is the one who's not offended by the things that God says and the Messiah that he's sent. So in conclusion, people sometimes reject clear evidence if its path leads to a place that they don't want to go. Jesus was presenting clear evidence, his miracles. For Pete's sakes, he just raised the guy from the dead. but a lot of the people weren't interested in following where that evidence pointed, because when Jesus presented what it took to be a disciple and the sacrifices and the lifestyle that was going to entail, a lot of them were like, yeah, I'm going to kind of talk myself out of going in that direction. I just want to keep living the life that I am living. In application, then we need to follow the evidence and not dismiss proof and truth just because we find it either offensive or it's leading in a direction that we don't want to go. We can either lie to ourselves our entire life, or we can follow the truth. I mean, it's pretty much that simple. I'd encourage you to follow the truth, because if there is a God and there is a truth and there's a morality that he defines, that's going to matter a whole lot down the road. Okay, well, we are going to take a break for the next couple days. Pick up next Monday, the Monday after Christmas. So I hope everyone enjoys their holidays. I'm going to eat. No, I'm not. I'm going to drink a bunch of eggnog. That's my only thing that I really want on Christmas. I'm going to get a liter of that stuff at the store, and I'm going to drink it. I'm not going to read the nutrition label. It's going to be great. I hope that you and your loved ones can make it through Christmas without any heart attacks, and lay off the Christmas cookies if you have to. But in all sincerity, I wish everybody happy holidays, and enjoy the time that you have with your families if you get to spend it. And if you don't, know that God is always with you.